As we all know, Philadelphia is suffering from an eviction crisis. In Philadelphia in 2016, 22,500 eviction filings were recorded, representing more than 1 in 14 Philadelphia renters. This number does not reflect the impact of illegal evictions, which may be double that of formerly filed evictions. Research shows that eviction is not only a symptom of poverty, but also causes poverty through increasing job losses, learning losses for youth, and deteriorating mental and physical health. In response to this crisis, in September 2017, we established the Mayor's Task Force on Eviction Prevention and Response. The task force consisted of 22 appointed members, including landlords, tenants, researchers, community advocates, and members of city government. I asked this group to look into this growing crisis and provide us with specific recommendations of what we can do as a city to address it. Earlier this year, we announced the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project. This offered a new set of services for tenants facing evictions with the goal of reducing the number of evictions and providing more resources to tenants in danger of losing their homes. I want to thank the co-chairs, Liz Hirsch and Mitch Little, all of the members of the task force, and our leaders from City Council on this issue, including Council members Helen Gim and Curtis Jones. We look forward to reviewing these recommendations together. Together we can tackle this crisis. So I want to thank everyone again for all your hard work in this regard, and we will take your report and try to implement as much of all possible and move forward from there. So we recognize the problem. Anyone else speaking? Okay.
Good morning. I'm Mitch Little, Executive Director of Office of Community Empowerment and Opportunity. We want to thank the mayor for his leadership in establishing the task force and creating a roadmap to guide us in tackling this very, very important issue. In addition to the experts who comprise the task force, we received inputs and ideas from over 200 individuals through focus groups, community forums, stakeholder interviews to fully understand the dimension of the problem and what could be done to address it. We also worked very closely with the courts, and we wanted to publicly sort of give our appreciation for their participation. The task force began by defining eviction as an involuntary residential move initiated by a property owner or manager due to non-payment of rent, lease violation, end of lease term, or other breakdown in the contract between landlord and tenant. We include both formal legal evictions that authorize through the courts and informal illegal evictions, which include illegal lockouts, cutting off utilities, removing doors, tenant harassment, and other cases which a tenant is forced to move or feel as though they are forced to move due to a landlord's action or inaction. The task force was sought to develop a clear understanding of the Philadelphia eviction landscape. So understanding who is being evicted, sort of what the process is and what resources are currently available to them. We looked at best practices both locally and nationally, including a program called Home Base, which you'll hear a little bit more about from Liz. And then we also identified the problems of the eviction process and proposed strategies to both reduce the number of evictions, but also more importantly, or equally as importantly, lessen the impact. Through the task force meeting, public comment sections, and analysis of the scale and legal process of eviction, the task force identified challenges we need to address and balance the scales to reduce the number of evictions. So broadly, we categorize these challenges in 4 buckets. The first is lack of information and education. We understand that a lot of both tenants and landlords might not be clear on the process, their rights and responsibilities, and also landlords and tenants are often unaware of the resources available to help them. And so resources would be bucket number 2. We also realize that there are legal, policy, and regulatory factors that are contributing to the eviction crisis that can be ameliorated. For example, if 2 parties come to agreement and are able to negotiate an issue, they might not see each other until court, and then we understand that oftentimes that's too late in the process. And the 4th bucket is improving housing standards and enforcement that impact evictions. And so tenants may often withhold rent because of poor housing quality, but yet there are very few loans or grants that are available to small sort of mom and pop landlords. And so we wanted to make sure that they had some resources to get their properties fixed up to meet the standards. I'm going to turn it over to Liz Hurst, who will be talking more about sort of our recommendations within these 4 buckets. Liz?
Thanks, Mitch. It was really fun to work on this together. We came at it from different perspectives. First, I want to acknowledge all of the people who are here today who were members of the Eviction Task Force, staff who did so much of the legwork, and other stakeholders who participated in the public comment, the input sessions, and other sources of invaluable information. Could you please just stand for a moment if you were part of putting this together? It was a very rich process. I think we've all heard a lot about the housing affordability crisis. Just last week, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition released its annual Out of Reach report, and the numbers are pretty dire. There are less than 30 available affordable rental units for every 100 renters who are living on about $24,000 a year or less. So to some extent, the eviction crisis is an affordability crisis. But we didn't stop there. There are still many interventions that we assessed could have an impact that would be, in many cases, a win-win for the owner and the tenant, and that could slow the train down of the eviction crisis, then the destabilizing impact that it has on many individuals and families, and particularly low-income African-American women. And in fact, Matt Desmond has gone so far, who's kind of the godfather of this work, to say that the eviction crisis is, for low-income African-American women, the female correlate to mass incarceration for men. And so we take that very seriously when we look at this. So we have 17 recommendations, so given everyone's attention span, including my own, and the fact that you all get a copy of this report in just a few minutes, let me just highlight a few of these that we thought were really things that would be high impact that we could do right away. The first thing is we have many sources of support and information in the city for both tenants and property owners in eviction. But you have to chase around after them. And so one of the first things we want to do is, and one of our first and primary recommendations, is to inventory all of those resources and make them available in a more readily accessible format so that they're easier for people to use. And so that, if you think about the buckets that Mitch articulated, one of the first areas that we really want to focus on is reaching out to tenants who are facing eviction or who are likely to be facing eviction and help them get information and make it easier to access the information that is there. The second area is similar around resources and making the information about resources easier to access so that all of us who are working in this have a sense of what's available and how to take advantage of what resources there may be. Another area that Mitch talked about was housing standards. While the main cause of eviction that's stated in the filing is non-payment of rent, we heard from tenants that one of the reasons that they often don't pay the rent is because there are repairs that are needed, or that what we call the implied warranty of habitability has not been upheld, and so they withhold their rent. But the other side of the coin is that most of our property owners in Philadelphia are mom and pop, 1 to 4 units, and often they can't afford major capital expenses. And so we have already begun the process of piloting a small rental loan fund for mom and pop landlords to try and make some of these repairs. But we have other recommendations that go beyond that around code enforcement and also around, again, the information. When can you repair and deduct, and what for, and how can that situation be more amicably resolved? Mitch talked a little bit about our fourth bucket, which is legal processes and policies. And I think one of the things that really became clear to us through this process, and I want to acknowledge Judge Rizzo, who was very instrumental in this, is that it's really a very quick slide from the time an eviction is filed, not necessarily in time-wise, but the process is very quick to ending up in court. And so one of the things that doesn't exist is a place and a time where the landlord and the tenant can come together, perhaps with a third party, and say, can we come to some meeting of the minds before they come into the municipal court? And so I think that was another area where we saw, just like the foreclosure prevention and diversion work that we did so successfully in this city around the foreclosure crisis, that there's really an opportunity to create a venue for landlords and tenants to come together and try to come to some resolution before it gets to court. So those are just some of the highlights of the solutions out of the 17 recommendations. We're going to begin work right away this summer. Many of the members of the task force have already volunteered to hit the ground running. We really formed a nice set of relationships between landlords, tenants, advocates, lawyers to try and come up with solutions, and we're really excited to move forward to see if we can move the needle on this problem. Thank you.
I'm going to invite Councilwoman Gim to the podium. Councilwoman, I just want to publicly say thank you for your commitment to this issue and your participation in our process. Councilwoman Gim.
Thank you, Mitch. First of all, I am just incredibly grateful to be in this room today with all of our task force members, but also acknowledging the incredible work that our advocates, our legal community, organizers, elected and appointed officials in our city government have done to really advance this issue and bring it out of the shadows and into the realm of what cities can actually do. Of course, it would be a wonderful thing if we had a federal Department of Housing that really and seriously invested in affordable housing and the need to address a major crisis in housing, not only here in Philadelphia, but all across the country. But in the absence of that, what this community has shown over the last year and a half is that we are not only deeply committed to this issue, we are taking actions that put us at the forefront of the nation in terms of being as proactive as possible, as broad as possible, and as inclusive as possible in the fight to address the eviction crisis. So last year, when we heard from our advocates that evictions in Philadelphia were 4 times the rate of foreclosures, we got down and got right to work. We got angry too, when we heard that illegal evictions were happening off the books, when lawyers told us that they were hitting wall after wall with too little funding to represent many of the tenants and Philadelphians who needed them the most. And especially in City Council during a hearing in which we heard so much from women, especially women who were single heads of household, taking care of their children, when we heard from our veterans and from our seniors, from our disabled community, we knew that things had to get done. And that's why I'm so incredibly grateful for the leadership of Mitch and Liz, Eva Gladstein and her entire team and her dedicated staff who have really put this task force together. I know that some people may think about task forces in a particular way. I'm new to city government, so I don't have a ton of experience, but I will say that in my experience working on the anti-eviction task force, I thought it was a incredibly important and invigorating gathering of individuals. Like, I was excited when I saw the task force on my schedule at 8:30. Once a month, because we got to hear from people. We didn't just talk amongst ourselves. We didn't come in with a fixed program and get entrenched into our own areas. We came in with a mutual understanding that there is a lot to learn about a very, very complicated crisis that impacts us and where each and every one of us has a role to play. We went and listened in landlord-tenant court. We held public meetings. We listened, debated, we heard from one another as a group that was seeking common ground, a common understanding, and committed to a common goal. And because of that, I think we came out with these incredibly powerful recommendations. It's our responsibility to implement them. I'm really glad to be part of a city council that has put more funding towards affordable housing and our housing trust fund. I'm really excited in particular because I really want to talk about how we're going to expand that a little more. We're going to need to talk about local rent subsidies. The reality is that in Philadelphia, while the minimum wage here is $7.25 an hour, which is an absolute sin in the state of Pennsylvania, $2.83 an hour for tipped workers, the housing wage for a two-bedroom affordable house in Philadelphia is over $25 an hour. So we've got a lot of work to do, and it's a very real reality that our city is going to have to step up. And when cities like ours step up and show that we can make a difference, we can work with other cities doing the same and push that vision up and out towards our state capitals, our state legislatures, and heaven help us towards Washington, D.C. But I'm incredibly grateful for all of the work of all the members of the task force. It's been an absolute pleasure to sit with you over the last 8 months, to learn so much from you. Thank you again, Liz and Mitch and Eva, for your incredible leadership on this issue, and I look forward to seeing what we can do.
I don't think we can overemphasize just the value of the voices and the perspectives that we had participating. One valuable voice I'd like to welcome up, Paul Badger, President and CEO of the Badger Group and board member of HAPCO. Paul.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. My name is Paul Badger. I've been a landlord in Philadelphia for 23 years. I also serve on several boards in Philadelphia that are landlord-related as well as building-related. And we're all facing a very difficult issue. Evictions is the last and most unintended consequence of renting a property that anyone wants to have. It's the last that the landlord wants to have, and it's the last that the tenant wants to have. And in fact, it creates a lose-lose-lose situation. And so I just want to talk about that just very briefly this morning and try to put some of this in context as to how landlords, tenants, and the city are all affected by the crisis that we face. The city loses each time there's an eviction. We have an already bogged down court system that has to deal with evictions on a daily basis. The city has to allocate valuable resources that could potentially go to other sources that are also vitally needed. So for the city, it creates a hardship. For tenants who are forced to be displaced from their properties, it's a horrible and dreadful situation. Children are often displaced from their schools, having to relocate in the middle of school years. Families are being removed from their support systems in their current environment and having to relocate and start somewhere else. It's a horrible lose situation for tenants. And it's also a lose situation for landlords who are forced with very slim margins in a business where you have a lot of expenses, you have limited income, and you're forced to deal with additional pressures in the case of an eviction, where you're dealing with loss of rent for an extended period of time. This can cause a hardship for anyone in any business, but particularly in the business of real estate, it can cause a lot of unintended consequences, such as default on mortgages, foreclosure, and landlords having to abandon properties, which leads to blight and crime and other things that are very negative for the city and for the individual. So no one wins in the face of an eviction. And I just want to take a moment to commend the mayor and his administration, all that participated in making this task force a reality and facilitating it, and all who participated in it. We didn't agree on everything, not that anyone expected that, but we agreed on a lot. And I think we took giant steps to move this needle forward, bring the issue to the limelight and to the forefront, and hopefully continue this hard work, because evictions benefit no one, and all of us are stakeholders in this fight to help make the city affordable for everyone, genuinely safe and wonderful living conditions for everyone, and to create a win-win situation instead of a lose-lose situation. And I thank you for your time. I thank you for the ability to be able to participate in this task force.
You've heard from some very important and distinguished folks today, but the next person that I'm about to introduce you to is an absolute powerhouse. And I say that because of her spirit and her will and her warmth. The first time I met this woman, it was at one of our annual summits, and she stood up in the crowd and said, "Mr. Little, how do you make sure that more people like me are able to come to your event?" And we've been working since then to make that a reality. Ms. Imani Sullivan.
Good morning. My name is Imani Sullivan, and I'm a witness to hunger. I'm also a mother of three, an 18-year-old, 11-year-old, and a 3-year-old. I would like to thank Mayor Kenny, Mitch Little, and Liz Hirsch for allowing me for the opportunity to be a part of the eviction task force. By working with the task force, I was able to educate my community, my family, and friends, and we all learned about evictions and tenants' rights. My experience of almost getting evicted was I was living in an apartment, and my landlord was always late on paying a water bill, so my water was always shut off sometimes. I received a leak in my ceiling, and by the time he came to fix the leak, the hole in the ceiling was so big that you can fit a body inside of it. I called L&I. That's the only thing that I knew to do. Once I called L&I, I received a letter from my landlord stating that my rent was going from $650 to $775. If I couldn't pay my rent, then I would have to move. So I sold everything in my apartment, including my phone, my kids' toys, appliances, so that I can have enough money to save up to move. So I moved back home with my mother so that I wouldn't receive an eviction on my credit report. My kids slept on the couch, I slept on the floor. I met a landlord who explained to me the process of me not getting evicted, but by then it was already too late. I had moved back with my mother by then. Also, I met someone who was a tenant like me who didn't know her rights, didn't know that we had any rights. So her and her children was forced to move out of her home that she lived in for 15 years to go move in a shelter. I didn't know that you were supposed to file paperwork, save your money, and put it in the bank. So, like I said, me and my kids were absolutely put on the street. So, with that being said, I'm so happy that y'all started this task force, so that people like me, as Mr. Mitch said, can understand what's the process, what we have to do to prevent an eviction. I just want to dwell on a little bit about Mr. Mitch. Like he said, I stood up and I asked him a question about how can someone in low income or in poverty like me be a part of these task forces, be a part of these organizations, be a part of this meeting. So I owe you a great big hug at the end of this, because without you, my family wouldn't know, my community wouldn't know, I wouldn't know how to save my house without you. Thank you, Mr. Mitch.
Thanks, everybody, for your remarks. I want to acknowledge and thank the sheriff for being here, Sheriff Williams, who is part of this process. It's the end part of the process, but we're happy that he's interested in this and is here today. And anybody have any questions?
How do these recommendations impact the squatter law?
Do you have any idea? I don't know. I don't know. Hold on.
Squatters, by definition, are people who are not paying rent and are not lawfully there. Assessing that may be complicated. That's a whole different discussion. Tenants have a lawful right to be in the property, whether it's through a verbal lease or a written lease. So this is related to tenants who have a contract with the owner of the property to occupy that space. Can you repeat the question?
The issue is that a lot of homeowners, on one hand, are saying we're worried about removing tenants who can't afford to pay. Is that going to be impacted through these changes?
What we are trying to do is to create some greater flexibility in the process so that we can get as close to a win-win situation as possible, whether it's getting repairs that are needed, whether there's financial assistance available, whether it's coming to some agreement about what is an adequate rent to be paid. So it's really trying to expand the options that are available to landlords and tenants so that the only logical outcome, or the inevitable outcome, is an eviction. And I think that's what we learned through this process, is that there's a lot more opportunity to come to a win-win solution than we currently have, and that's what this is really all about.
It's actually similar to Judge Rizzo's court, where there was an opportunity because people didn't know where to go or what to ask or what to file. So bringing, the homeowner together with the creditor, with a mediator, a lot of times, gets you where they both need to be. I think this is a similar replication of that process, eventually, ultimately, where the two sides come together and, she talks about the hole in her roof and the fact that our water keeps getting shut off, or maybe there's a tenant just refusing to pay, and, that kind of stuff, back and forth. But the tenant needs to have information. The landlord-tenant court, they have options that they can avail themselves of, and I'm sure if you're in the business, you know what those rules and regulations are. I think a lot of times the tenant doesn't have any idea what the rules and regulations are and are at the mercy of the system. Anything else? Okay, thank you.